how we can harness energy from our biomolecules, again, specifically looking at glucose as an example. But please remember that we can also harness energy from fats and proteins, although the body rarely ever taps into proteins as a fuel source. So the main medium of energy exchange in the body is ATP. We talked about ATP when we looked at our nucleotides. And just to remind ourselves of the structure of ATP, there's this purine ring, there's a carbohydrate ring, and then there are 3 phosphates attached. So this area where we have 3 phosphates is where the magic really is. This is where the energy is stored in those phosphate groups. Now, basically, that single phosphate at the end, so that 3rd phosphate, is where we have most of the energy stored. So simply making and breaking this ATP by cleaving or adding this last phosphate is how we can exchange energy when when ATP only has 2 phosphates bound. It's called ADP, and that is in its low energy state. Whereas when it has that 3rd phosphate on there, it's ATP, triphosphate, and that is in its high energy state where it's ready to donate that energy to some type of cellular process. So let's talk about how ATP is made. So this is a similar process to what we talked about before. We have ADP, we have a phosphate, and we need to take some energy to yield ATP, and we're going to release water as a byproduct, and so that makes this a condensation reaction. So this is also an endergonic reaction because we're storing up energy, usually about 7 kilocalories per mole for a single molecule of ATP to be made. And the reason that we make ATP is to store up that energy so that we can use it to do something else later. That's going to be the big backdrop of our entire discussion. We only make ATP to break ATP. It's kind of like a backup battery or a backup charger. You simply charge it so that you can have it for later on. Now, there are 2 mechanisms to make ATP, and they occur in 2 different ways in 2 different areas of the cell. The first one is called substrate level phosphorylation, and this is basically taking a phosphate from another molecule. So in this reaction here, X is representing some other molecule in the cell, which has a phosphate bound to it. ADP is going to grab that phosphate off, and we're going to release the molecule without its phosphate and ATP on the other end. So basically, we can compare this to stealing a phosphate or grabbing a phosphate or taking a phosphate from another source. This happens in the cytosol. I'll talk more about exactly how this occurs, but you'll hear me refer to this process as we go through the semester, sometimes as anaerobic glycolysis. And that's because we can do this, we can make ATP in this way in the absence of oxygen. Really important. So we don't yield a lot of ATP, but we can make it without oxygen, which is really convenient for some instances when you don't have enough oxygen. The other mechanism is oxidative phosphorylation. And as we can tell by the first part of that mechanism, we need oxygen for this process. So this is basically, again, we have ADP, and we're going to get a free-floating or inorganic phosphate, and this is not attached to any other molecule, and we're going to grab it, put it onto ADP, and make ATP that way. This is a much more sustainable, a much more efficient mechanism of generating ATP. This happens at another location in the cell, so this happens in the mitochondria. This requires oxygen, and this yields a lot more ATP, okay? So really important to distinguish these 2 mechanisms of generating ATP, because we're going to continue to refer to them as we go on to other topics and other systems. Let's look at how we break ATP down. So, as I mentioned earlier, ATP is only made to be broken, so it's basically a temporary storage for energy. And so, a very similar reaction, we have ATP on the left, and we have to insert water, and then on the right, we yield ADP. We have that phosphate that we grabbed off, and we yield energy, that energy that was stored to make ATP in the first place. This is a hydrolysis reaction, right? Just reminding ourselves of the fact that using water to drive this reaction makes this a hydrolysis reaction. Okay, so this is the overall equation that governs glucose oxidation. And you'll hear me use glucose oxidation, you'll hear me use aerobic respiration, you may even hear cellular respiration. Those are all referring to the exact same process. So don't get confused by those different terminology. So the overall equation that governs the breaking down of glucose to yield carbon dioxide, water, because it's a hydrolysis reaction, and energy, okay? Specifically about 686 kilocalories per mole of energy. Now, if we look at this reaction in the forward direction, this is what we do when we eat food. So we eat some type of glucose that comes in. Let's say we had a slice of toast or some cereal. Most of our diet consists of glucose in some capacity. And then obviously, this is the whole reason we're breathing oxygen, right? We bring in oxygen, which comes in our lungs, oxygenates through our vessels, goes to each of our tissues and eventually our cells. And so the glucose that we take in our diet and the oxygen that we breathe in are combined to yield carbon dioxide as a byproduct, water, and energy, okay? And if you look at this reaction in the reverse, we can see another type of reaction. Does anyone know what that reaction is? It's not one that happens in our physiology, but it's another reaction. Photosynthesis, right? So plants can take carbon dioxide, water, and energy from the sun, and they can yield oxygen and glucose. So this reaction can take place in the forward and reverse direction. This kind of shows us how plants and humans and other animals as well exist in this symbiotic relationship. They take in what we give off, and they give off what we take in, and vice versa. Okay. So on this slide, we're kind of illustrating how that glucose is oxidized. So this is basically the same reaction, right? Glucose and oxygen yielding carbon dioxide, water, and lots of energy. But what we really want to focus on here is that a lot of the energy is lost as heat. So we are not efficient beings. We must release some of this energy, most of it, in fact, as heat. And this is why if you're really metabolically active, if you're an athlete, if you're working out, if you're just highly metabolically active, you generate lots of heat. Your body physically gets really hot. And this is why. The more we break down or oxidize glucose, the more heat is released off. And so we release that heat. The rest of the energy that is liberated can be used to make ATP. This is pretty much the entire process that we'll talk about today, how that ATP is made. And then we can take that ATP, circulate it through our body, and it's basically the currency that our cells use to do work. And when we say work, we mean things like moving things around inside the cell. We mean making proteins, exploiting proteins, making hormones, and other types of fun cellular stuff, okay? So going back to that initial reaction, which we have here, and plugging in some more specific details in terms of the amount of ATP that we yield. So in our physiology, we invest 38 ADP. We grab or steal or substrate phosphorylate 38 phosphates, and that yields 6 carbon dioxide, 6 water, and 38 ATP. This amounts to about 266 kilocalories of energy. And so this is what actually happens in our physiology. But going back to our previous slide, we know that in theory, 1 molecule of glucose should yield us 686 kilocalories per mole. So basically, we only yield 266, but we know that we should yield 686. So that tells us that about 420 kilocalories of energy is lost as heat, okay? So a lot of that energy, most of it, 61% of the energy that's yielded from glucose is lost as heat, whereas about 38.8% is what our body can actually use in the form of ATP to do that cellular work. So this is kind of interesting, isn't it? So every glucose that you take into your diet, 60% of it is just lost, right? You can only use 38% of it to actually do cellular work. Okay. Now this can vary, and I don't want you to memorize this equation or the numbers here, but just really understand the efficiency of this process. And the numbers here can vary. So if you're an athlete, if you're pregnant, you may be able to yield a little bit more energy, so you may be a little bit more efficient versus elderly, or if you're diabetic or have some other type of pathology, you may yield a little bit less. So that can vary with age and time and physiology.